board. So you're appearing on your bottom of your screen saying it's recording. Otherwise, Chris, I think it's over to you, sir.
Wow. Okay then. I'll do the face before the. Hello, Holly. I'm going to make some apologies before it happens, because I'm talking to you from the home, and we have 2 dogs and people walking past the door. So if you hear the dogs, just clap, because that's real life. What we're going to go and do is descend into a bit of an unreal life. And I thought after 15, 20 years away from it, I'd be away from PowerPoint presentations. But you're going to get some PowerPoint presentation. And what we're going to try and do is break it up. You might see Peter in your line up there. I can't see him, but I know he's there because I've seen Ruben. And Peter is my cohort in the workshop. And he's going to save me. And he's also going to save you from listening to my voice for the next, 30 minutes or so. I hope that's okay. Thank you for, there's Peter. I've got Peter just come up there. Yep. And thanks for that, cohort. That's not a swear word, Pete. It means mate or buddy. Okay. Yeah. I have you. Okay, so the 996 and a conversation from Ralph, which went along the lines of, that was an interesting thing you did on a video during the lockdown. He said, would you be interested in sharing some more and some more of your experience with the Porsche Club and the modified register? And I said, absolutely, love to. Putting myself in front of the spotlight, literally, and trying to give you what we've learned. So 20 years in the industry. That's when Des had not so many grey hairs, and Ralph had a full head of hair, I guess. And 20 years worth of experience, and experience is experience. You can't take it away. And I did a quick calculation. We work with 85% of our throughput is Porsche. And if I were to account for my days, or our days, Pete's and myself, this is, are we qualified to use this information that we've gathered? And if we look at 4 996s a week, over 50 weeks, because we only get 2 weeks holiday, and I've only been working 10 years, that's 2,000 996s, just to put it into some. So we get a good general feeling about the 996 in all modes. So whether it's a low mileage car, 13,000 miles. I think we've had a couple of 30,000 mile gems, but a lot of the cars are coming in at about 90, 110, 120,000. What's the highest, Pete?
I think we've had one at 200.
200,000.
Yeah.
And yeah, a bit like Trigger's broom, you might think. But actually, the 996, despite the slants that are given, comparing it to the 993 and the build quality and so on, yes, it does have some components that wear, but generally, it says on the tin, 100,000 miles. This is Paul Freer, by the way. Paul Freer says, yeah, 996 was developed. It was developed with the Japanese Intel. And there's Mr. Ramsey.
Yeah, true.
Good evening, Nick.
He's on mute now.
Hooray. Now, so then, Yeah. So what we're going to do is go through some of our experience, and whilst other people working in other areas, that's engine or interior or body, everything that we know is suspension. In fact, we know the smell of the 996, and we know generally, because we drive them every day, obviously not sideways, but we drive them every day. So yeah, we're reasonably well qualified. So the agenda for this evening is we've got the block of information, which is suspension issues, why the handling and would degrade, including degradation of components within the suspension. The typical issues that arise, i.e. when I get a phone call, it's, I've got this issue with my 996. Do you think you can look at it? And we'll go, yes, we know the noise, and ultimately we can actually pin the noise down to a particular component with a bit of cross-referencing. We also, whilst we, in pursuance of doing our work, which is primarily chassis tuning, geometry, wheel alignment, four-wheel alignment, call it what you will. In pursuance of doing that, we need to make sure that the car is capable of holding the wheel in its optimum location, giving us optimum grip. And of course, some components aren't able to do that. So we're going to highlight those components as well. We've got some photographs of it's like a convicts lineup of components that have failed. And you've got Peter and myself. And as I say, Peter will dip in. I'll hand over to him, so you'd have to listen to me warble on. Questions at the end, as Ralph has mentioned. If I keep the words small, it's going to be difficult for me because I talk a lot. I'll listen to Phil Clark, who used to tell me to close your gob, Chris. So I'm going to dip straight in, and we're going to go into, I'm going to use my technology finger now and share my screen. So you're going to lose my face. Hopefully you're going to keep my voice, and I'm going to hit screen share, and there's this PowerPoint thing coming up. I kept it simple. Bear with me. This one here. And then share. Oh, now, things are happening. You are screen sharing, and I can still see people on the right hand side of the screen, and a cheeky beer there by Peter. Yeah, everybody can see that. Yeah. So we're talking the Porsche 996, and if I check that I can advance to the next screen. We've done that already. So what suspension issues are we seeing? Have we seen? Everybody clap. And why the handling degrades over time, and it's down to the performance of the components degrading. Some of the typical issues and what we're going to do about it to get it right. So typically, we'll get a phone call from a client that says, well, I think there's something wrong, not sure. Compared to my other car, do 911s all drive like this? It's doing things that maybe it's Porsche or maybe it's me. So there's a small selection of the opening gambits from callers inquiring about our services. There are some that just literally say it's making some right horrible noises and it's embarrassing me. The car's being looked at for all the wrong reasons, and in cases of a 996 GT3 sounding like Steptoe's car driving onto the petrol station because the DU bush is squeaking. So yes, it's a sports car. it's supposed to be an eventful drive. It's been made like that. It's a visceral drive with the control points and all of the sensations heightened for us, the sports car driver. But it's trying to filter out what is right and what is wrong. What is it supposed to do? Well, first and foremost, it's a car. And all cars, there's the perfect car, and all cars have a certain set of requirements, which are to keep you comfortable, to move in anticipation and work in anticipation of what your control input is, and to give some kind of comfort, and to drive like the perfect car. So I make no exceptions for the 911. The 911, despite the weight distribution and so on, which causes some quirks, the car should behave like a perfect normal car. So that is our opening gambit. So for all those people that are saying, well, this must be a 911 and trying to cut it some slack compared to the Fiesta, please just reevaluate that, redrive the Fiesta, perfect Fiesta, hopefully, redrive the 911, and the 911 should be the same. Obviously, there's more power, there's more grip, but it should just be compliant and a pleasurable drive. If it's not, then let's get something done about it. If I get to the next slide. So the 996, the theme of the driving the 996 is that we have a design of car that is designed to optimize grip for accelerating and braking. So we've got wide contact patches, and when those contact patches are deployed, we can move and we can turn and we can measure those things in G's, whereas the Fiesta, because of the contact patches, that's much smaller, don't create the G's that the 911 does. Many cars produce the first 60 feet acceleration time that the 911 does, because the weight is already over the contact patch and it gets us going. The control should be precise, and believe it or not, it's a road car first that can be used for sport, and the road car, the wheels go with the road. The wheels shouldn't leave the road. A vehicle where the wheels leave the road normally has got wings, and so the wheels should go with the road and breathe with the road, and there should be comfort for drivers and passengers. So many times I would hear the comment from customers that wifey won't get in the car. She won't come for a ride, or she won't go on the long haul holiday because of the lack of comfort in the car over long distances. So some of the gripes that we have, and these are off the top of my head, but the notes are there. The biggest bar none, I would say, for new drivers is the lightness of the touch at the steering wheel at reasonably high speeds. The other one is that the steering feels light and vague. So it's the front of the car, it's those things that are in front of us. And we find that people normally refer to the front of the car as being active, reactive, and the rear of the car being quiet and dulcet and in abeyance. That's a shame, really, because there's a lot of lovely experiences that have got to come from the rear, especially when we lean on the car, on the throttle, so when exiting the bend. And a lot of people are not getting to feel that because the front intimidates them, so they tend to not go and explore the rear of the car. I'm moving on. I wanted to just give a flavour of, and what you've got on the screen there is I nicked it out of the 996 Service and Technic. Some people would probably recognise that as we call it the LSA axle. It's a light, stable, agile axle. And it's actually been nicked from the 993, Porsche 993. People will argue, but ultimately it's a 5-link axle, all aluminium, except for the dampers in this case. Coil-over dampers, which is spring over coil, same as the 993. Wheel hubs, rear wheel hub, right, 80% of it is aluminium. There's forged aluminium in there as well, some of the links, and there's cast aluminium as well. And it's bolted to the infrastructure of the car for the Carrera 2 and Carrera 4 and 4Ss by rubber bushings. And the whole idea there is that noise, vibration, and harshness is limited in getting into the cabin. So I probably swore at people there when they thought, oh, hey, this is a new axle for a new era of car. But my understanding from readings was that Porsche couldn't afford development of the axle any further, so they refined it from the 993 and implemented it. Now, let's go to the front axle, because this will probably surprise you a bit more. So front axle, it's the same basic axle, whether it's C2, C4. In between the H frame there, you'll get what we call it, the front differential, and two drive shafts, two skinny drive shafts. But in essence, again, we got 80% aluminium, especially extending out to the wheels. So where you've got the wheel carrier, the caliper, the disc, the hub, and the wheel bearing, all of this is counted as the unsprung weight, and Porsche have done their level best to reduce that as a factor of the overall weight of the car, that which sits on top of the springs. It runs a McPherson strut, and again, a safe, cheap, cost-effective, good performing axle that does most of what a double wishbone axle would do, typical of a Ferrari or one of the hypercars, Lamborghini or McLaren. So that McPherson strut that you can see there is a coil-over damper affair, and that was used, obviously not with the coilover, as far back as the 1964 911, and Porsche have invested in this suspension form factor up until present. So the 991.2s still carry the McPherson strut, whereas the Panameras and the Cayenne and the Macan, they use a different form factor, which is not McPherson strut. So that's just to give you a heads up as to those things that we were talking about. So everything there, I think the only things that are missing really are the wheels and the tires, which are also special. And I think, yeah, I think we've left those out. But maybe Pete, put it on your list. Wheels and tires, Pete. Yeah, they're missing. Here's a bit of theory. Now, what I'm going to do is, hopefully, I'm just going to rejig my screen so I can see what's going on. There you go. So a bit of theory. You've got the 996 C4S. I thought that was quite a nice likening of the C4S. We've got the road with the waves at the bottom. I drew this myself, by the way, guys. And you can see that the car is coupled to the road via two springs at the front, springs at the back, and dampers, which are those upturned pistons in cups. And you've got a force, which is in red, which is a bump or a force created by the wheel being moved upwards by the bump. And you can see I've put degree C there. What's happening is these forces and displacements are being absorbed by the car suspension. Hopefully absorbed sufficient and isolating me, who's also sitting on a spring there, which is the spring in the seat, or the diaphragm in the seat. So that's me sitting on the top of a 964 C4S. And the process of absorbing this energy and these forces is managed by the suspension and then deployed and dissipated out by the suspension. And it does this typically, if it does it too stiff, it hurts our neck. If it does it too quick, it hurts our neck. And if it doesn't dissipate the energy soon enough, we'll be bobbing down the road for an ever amen, like step-toes wagging. So the car would be bouncing. I put degree C there because part of the process of managing the springs that have been compressed, and then they are deploying their energy, their potential energy, back down to the wheel onto the road and upwards up our seat, produce as a byproduct hot oil. Yeah, and of course the dampers need to sit in the airflow such that they can be cooled. So if we take chip fat, nice clean chip fat, and we cook our chips and time, ultimately the oil is heat cycled, is carbonized, and also it picks up the bits of potato, and we end up with impure oil, and we end up with black chip. If we were to look at the oil inside of a damper that has done its work, the oil is smelly and black and is less viscous than it was when it was initially put into the canister by the manufacturer, Bilstein. So there's degradation of the dampers by using them. The springs will degrade over time, not in terms of their ability to do their job, but under the load, constant load and work, they generally allow that 996 C4S and the turbo to get closer to the ground. So over a typical 120,000 miles, the car might drop from its factory ride height, maybe 20 mil, maybe 25 mil. That in itself causes us issues down the line. So theory part one, theory part two, the wheels. So on the right hand side there, we've got my impression of a wheel, and we've got the body, that's the sprung mass of the 996 C4S, and connecting the wheel to the sprung mass are our control arms or links. And these links, I've drawn some blue arrows showing rotation. Now, the rotation then allows for a bump to push the wheel up, displace the wheel, and the spring and the damper put it back down in controlled fashion. But the links with their pivots either end allow displacement and allow Porsche to precisely dictate the path that the wheel will follow. Now, these links, or pivot arms or control arms, are defined, for example, on the 996 rear axle as the 5 links of the multi-link system. And common to each of those links is a pivot at either end. So if we look at those pivots, which is where most of the gripes of the 996 will arise from, I'll show you. Swipe the screen. There you go. So that's a link ball joint, and it's the I mean, common ball joints are as old as God's dog on cars. They are a device that allows rotation in pretty much every plane. So there's 5 degrees of rotation there. The only one that's missing is the ability to push the pin into the ball and out. And that one's controlled, so there's no deformation there, but you can waggle that ball joint in every which direction, even turn it around. And I think that one's a 993 in a forged toe control arm. And you can see it's environmentally sealed. And if we did a section of that, you'd find that it's a beautifully induction hardened chrome steel sitting in a nice tight cup, which is cast or forged and isolated with some engineering nylon. Let's go to the other end of the link, and there's the bush. I call it a metalastic bush. Metalastic are actually a manufacturer, probably coined the phrase in their first. I mean, if we look at a 993 top mount, you'll still see Metalastic's name in the cast into the vulcanized rubber there. So the Metalastic bush comprises of a rubber aluminium, yeah, remember the unsprung weight, core, and this is bolted to the either the wheel carrier or to the car, and it behaves like a spring in that we push it and it will react back, and it also allows rotation in all planes. That's in, out, up, down, round, rotational, but limited. And we find that these bushes have different hardnesses. In something I did recently with the Porsche 993 rear axle, bearing in mind that the 996 rear axle is a derivative, if not refined, uses different hardness and rigidity of bush to perform different functions. Some are allowed to deform and others resist deformation. And again, this is part of the root cause of some of the ills that we're getting creeping into 996 handling and giving us some of the issues that we get on the phone. I'll move next to, and I'll move that out of the way. So I'm playing, what's that game where you move tiles around on the screen? The Achilles heels of the 996 handling. Okay, I'll refer back to my experience. We take a 13,000 mile 996 that's been sympathetically stored with new tires, because and the car is how old? How old is it going to be now? It's a 1998 car. It's one of the first, and it's got that turquoise interior, jade interior. There you go. 13,000 miles, and the car drives exquisite. So much so, like our perfect Ford Fiesta, it's juicy, compliant, there are no noises, it anticipates my next move, it behaves like a normal car when I'm driving it at normal speeds, and my wife would delight to drive in it. So what's changed? That between that and the other 2,000 996s that we've seen over the last 10, 15 years. And the difference is miles, and the difference is fun, and the duty, the work it's done. So if you can imagine, when we're looking back at, for example, the damper, and we're looking at a ball joint, fun, miles, and duty, load, changing directions, managing forces, trying to absorb the energy from the bumps in the road, all take their toll. And for ball joints, friction is the enemy, and that friction is normally the wear point. With rubber, you've got, what's the word I'd like to use? It is herniation. It's taking the rubber beyond its limit, add a bit of oxidization to the substrate where it's vulcanized and it peels away, and throw at it the everything that's on the road, quite a harsh environment, and the rubber shrinks from its job. The problem there then is wear occurs, and remember, these pivots and control arms are designed to move the wheel or the wheels in a programmed manner to optimize the contact patch, give a bit of safety and fun, so that we can drive a bit quicker in our sports car, and flatter ourselves as a driver, and be safe. And soon as these components wear, that's the bushes and ball joints. This is going to get quite boring, really, isn't it? Because we're talking about upgrades and whatever, but this is the reality. The wheels then choose the path that the road determines, because there's a degree of freedom, all of which are supposed to be controlled, and that's where the nub of our problems lie. So we're allowing, typically, bushes represent, I would say 80%, 70%, 70% of all of the work that we do in restoring a car to that 13,000 miler, and control of the wheels as we accelerate and brake and turn. 70% are bush related issues, and then the 30% are down to ball joints. Now the ball joints typically start going loose, so we get to hear the issue before we feel it. And when we do evaluation run of cars, we find that we're listening for certain noises, and we can then pinpoint. So when we're talking to customers over the phone, we're saying, is it making this noise? Is it a rattle, or is it a squeak, or is it a clunk? We're homing in on the issues that are arising. This in front of us is people get surprised when we're on the evaluation run, normally with the customer, and we go onto the cobble street, and I'll say, we'll just do this at 5 miles an hour, all quiet. The heating and the blower off, and the windows are closed, and we'll start hearing a cacophony of noises. We call it the snooker balls noise. So it's ball joints that are making clackety-clack plastic noises. And I'll say to the customer, there's 12 ball joints in your front axle. So it's 6 either side. And his eyebrows will raise, because he's thinking, that's 6 times huge cost, because we don't like to allow a degree of freedom in ball joints, especially if it's connected to the steering wheel. So on the screen here are all of those things that we replace mostly. And you can see there, we've got dampers. They're at the top of the list. They shouldn't be at the top of the list. Dampers and springs should be right at the bottom, along with wheel bearings. I would put on the front axle, right at the top, for making noise, diagonal arms. And then I would put track control arms. And then I would put steering, which is inner rod ends and outer rod ends. And Pete will come on to those in a bit. And on the rear is crafty, because it can hide the wear away from our ears. So unless it's particularly bad. One of the noises that we do hear is when the bush has completely let go of the control arm, and the control arm is rubbing on the subframe of the car. and it makes a grinding,
No,
a
it's
creaking noise.
46 people.
It's like the Addams Family front door opening, which is a.
I register.
So you can see there that all of these things, if we were complaining to the service, OPC service, and saying all these things are worn on my 120,000 mile car, they would say, of course, sir, these are all wear and tear items. And I guess, yeah, they're rubber, and you give them duty and you enjoy them, and potentially we're going to have to replace them. I'm going to move to Peter now, because I want Peter to go into a bit more detail, show us some of these things. These things are causing us, well, we feel the issues on the road, we can hear them, and they get in the way of enjoying the car. And what Pete's going to do is also go into those alternatives, how we replace them, and what we replace them with, and yeah, and some of the options and some of the trials, tribulations, and pitfalls. We've got Ian from Porsche Shop, which is awesome, because I know that Ian can then chip in and say, yes, guys, yeah, that particular supplier has got good credibility. That supplier, we've not been working with them so long. That supplier normally provides good, let's say example, restoration components. However, we're getting in short supply. So it'd be good for Ian to chime in at the end, possibly, if Ian can hear me. And he'll also see what kind of components are moving out in car restorations. Peter, it's over to you, sir. And I was going to, if you give me the nod, or Chris, next screen, and I can do the swiping for you. How's that?
I'll leave it on that screen for now.
Okay.
I think it's worth mentioning while we're there, obviously that's the inventory of general 996 parts. But within that list, there's also variations of each of those parts dependent on the model of the car. So, you know, 996 C2, C4, coupe, cabriolet, automatic gearbox, manual gearbox, MO29 ride height, MO33 ride height, MO30 ride height. So if we use, I don't know, springs, the front springs as an example, there's probably 8 versions of that spring for the 996, and that's just for the front axle. So you can see that there's quite a lot to go at. Same for the rear, even more obvious for the rear. Obviously the gearbox plays more of an issue. So although the list is long, it's probably 8 or 10 times longer than that if we break it down by individual model. If we can go to the next screen, which is of interest to most people. So that is one of our parts bins since Christmas. And you can see that's a large black wheelie bin that is full. And we've got 2 of those. And that is just 996 and 997 parts.
That's this morning.
So that was taken this morning. So there's a fair old stash there. And going back to what Chris said at the beginning, the amount of 996s and 997s that we've worked on, that is just worn parts since Christmas between 2 of us. So you can see that these parts are causing 996s and their owners some grief. So that'll get emptied again probably in the next month or 2, and come Christmas we'll be back at that stage again, more than likely. So if we go to the next one, because that was more just for interest's sake, track control arms, or if you're not that familiar with car parts, you will have heard of wishbones, I'm sure. So this is the lower wishbone. front and rear on the 996. So for most models, they're the same. Track control arm, coffin arm, lower control arm. If you look at the picture on the right-hand side, hopefully you can understand why it gets the name coffin arm. Looks like a mummy's coffin. These are probably the most common part that we change on the 996. More often than not, because of the inner bush, which is at the mummy's coffin, the feet. This is the part that pivots on the subframe, front and rear axle. The bushes delaminate, which you can see on the top photograph. It's an aluminium part with a steel shell and a rubber bush with an aluminium centre and a steel bolt going through it. And we throw a little bit of Britain's weather in there and some of the council's best salt for good measure. And this is what happens, and the bush actually separates from the arm. And you normally, the first thing you know about this is you get a creaking noise that we refer to as frogs. So it's a real kind of normally going over speed bumps or in and out of petrol station forecourts, you know, on and off your drive, in and out your garage, that kind of thing. When they get really quite bad, you will notice that under hard acceleration or hard braking, that the car might become unpredictable. So you can actually get the car to change direction using throttle or braking. And it can be really quite disconcerting because it's usually very inconsistent and you can't always reproduce it the same. This is probably the most important bush on the 996. So we're quite particular about this being in the best condition that it could be in. If we take that bush as a whole and class it as 100%, that means that one side of that bush is 50%, the other side is 50%. As soon as those bushes get to a total of 50% worn, we are really quite insistent that they're changed. Because as soon as they get more worn than that, it really is a downward spiral from there. We'll get into the options in terms of what can be done about that. Some people would like to just rectify that particular problem and just change the bush that's in question. Other people will replace the whole arm. There's pros and cons for both, which we'll get to later. The issue normally arises when it comes to the mileage that the part has done. You know, these parts we've seen wear, you know, 40,000, 50,000 miles. We've also seen them still good at 80 to 90,000 miles. Obviously, the issue being that if we replace the bush on an arm that's done 90,000 miles, it usually would be a ticking time bomb that the ball joint and the other bush, which is at the mummy's shoulders, will likely fail soon thereafter. But we'll get into that in a little bit more detail nearer the end when we've got the upgrade section. If we can go to the next screen, which should be rod ends. So these are steering rod ends, front axle, and it's the bits that bolt onto the end of your steering rack. So you've got the steering wheel, which is the bit that you're connected to. You've got the steering column and the UJs, which go down from the steering wheel down to the rack. Then you've got your power steering rack, and then the one on the right, which looks like a drumstick, that goes onto the end of the steering rack, and then the slightly silvery, brighter one goes on the end of that, and that bolts to your wheel carrier. No rubber bushes in this part, so the steering rack is bolted directly to your subframe, and you've got a ball joint on that inner and a ball joint on that outer. So it's quite a direct link between the steering wheel and the road wheel, whereas on previous versions of the 911, the 993 and the 964, the rack and the inner point were actually rubber isolated to give a bit of compliance. So on the 996, they really did sharpen things up. Again, absolute utmost importance that these are in the best of health that they can be. Most wheel alignment equipment can accurately set, you know, an 18-inch wheel to less than 0.1 of a millimeter. When these ball joints wear out, it's quite normal for us to be able to see a millimetre, even 2 millimetres of play at the wheel. So we are really quite particular that these are in the best of health. In terms of you knowing about them, the first thing that most people notice is vagueness, or some people refer to it as a woolly sensation in the steering. So you'll be driving along, even 50, 55 miles an hour on a nice bit of smooth British well-surfaced tarmac, and the front of the car you might find starts to just move around slightly, or the opposite, the car might not move around and the steering wheel might move around slightly. This then causes you to take a bit more notice of what you're doing, because the front of the car isn't doing what you're asking it to do. Very worst case scenario, when they're severely worn, you can actually get them to rattle. So the cobbled street test that Chris mentioned before, we can actually get these to make a snooker ball clackety clack rattle going along the cobbled street. This is the sort of part that would normally be picked up at an MOT. So the usual MOT tester that grabs the wheel at 9 o'clock and 3 o'clock would ordinarily be able to pick this kind of thing up. Usually it's the inner rod end that gets it, and usually it's those cars that are wearing larger wheels. So the guys that are running on 18-inch wheels, some guys are on 19s. We've even seen 996s now that are on 20-inch wheels. The bigger the wheel, the more stress gets put on these components. So again, if we go on the trend, it's normally the front left. This is the wheel that spends most of its time in the bad part of the road, the potholes, the grids, the grates. So we want to make sure that these are in the best condition. The outer rod end, which is the one on the left, it's quite unusual for them to wear, in the sense that they would rattle or knock. We normally find that these over time go stiff, which is it's the lesser of two evils, really. You have an inner that goes loose and an outer that goes stiff. And you can get to a point where you can actually turn the steering wheel, and because of the stickiness or the stiffness in that outer ball joint, the car will actually just remember the last turn. So if you've just done a right-hand bend, and you're not familiar with taking the lock back off, the car will just continue to turn right. And you can get to a point where you're driving down a nice straight road and you're just constantly correcting the thing because of the stickiness in the front steering. We refer to them as arthritic when this happens, so you can get a joint that is stick, slip, where we like them to be nice and fluid and easy to rotate. You should be able to turn those parts by hand quite easily. So if we go to the next one, which is diagonal control arms. Some people refer to them as diagonal arms, link arms, radius arms. In the aftermarket, they're referred to as tuning forks. And if you do bang it on the worktop, it does make the noise of a tuning fork. No rubber parts again in this component. So you've got a ball joint at the top, and it's a forked clevis, if you will, that takes a bite out of the mummy's shoulders on the coffin arm, and it's the relationship between this diagonal arm and the coffin arm which makes your familiar wishbone setup. So the ball joint that is at the top on the front axle is bolted directly to the chassis of the car, and it's this component that is the usual, I would say, 95% culprit for that snooker ball's rattle that we get. So that clackety clack on broken road surface, it's that component. You've got exactly the same component on the rear axle. Again, it takes a bite out of the coffin arm and then is bolted to the chassis, kind of underneath where the rear passenger's bum would be. So again, if you get a snooker ball's kind of rattle coming from behind you, and the passengers in the back could swear blind it was coming from near their bum, that's your guy. In terms of how this affects the performance of the car, I can't say that we've ever driven a car that's been absolutely perfect, but with worn diagonal arms, and noticed any change in performance. It's more of an annoying noise. So in terms of how you might diagnose this on the road, other than the noise, you probably wouldn't know. The car doesn't display any bad habits. It doesn't wander. It doesn't tend to tramline. It's more of an annoying rattle, and it's one of those rattles that once you've heard it, you can't not hear it. So if we point it out to a customer on the calibration drive and we found it on the cobbled street, they then can't go away and not hear it again, unfortunately. Some people think that it's just a quirk of the car. They go, oh, well, you know, they all make that noise. No, they don't, and no, they shouldn't. Again, it's one of those noises that we like to think that we're quite tuned into. Right, next one, please, Chris. Right, top mounts. So, top picture is the 996, 997 C2, so two-wheel drive top mounts. And the pictures underneath are for the four-wheel drive, so C4, C4S and turbo. We haven't included GT3 in this picture. That's another kettle of fish, but we'll concentrate on C2 and C4. You may or may not notice that the C2 top mount, which is the silver one, is quite a simple design. It's a triangle with a rubber bush in the middle of it. Nice, plain, simple, and not a great deal to go wrong there. It's a steel outer case with an aluminium bush in the middle, and it's potted in quite a compliant rubber. The bottom picture, which is the four-wheel drive top mount, you'll notice, although it's still a triangle shape and it bolts into a similar sized hole, is articulated slightly, and it's at quite an angle. This puts the damper at quite a different angle to the two-wheel drive cars, and this is to get round the drive shaft. So the C4 and turbos obviously run a front drive shaft, and the damper got in the way. So Porsche had to odge it out the way. As a result of that, the C4 and turbo cars have quite a lot of strain on their front top mounts, to the point where we would class it as normal for these to only last maybe 40,000 miles. So if you've got a C4 or a turbo and you've done 40,000, 80,000 or 120,000, you're probably going to be in for hearing some interesting noises soon or thereabouts. The two-wheel drive ones, you can kind of double that. Normal for OEM Porsche C2 top mount, 70, 80,000 miles is quite normal because they have quite an easy job. The top mount doesn't have to do any of the steering. There's a bearing that goes underneath that, which we've not included in the picture, to allow it to pivot. Normal culprits for when these wear out, it's more noticeable on the four-wheel drive cars. To start off with, they squeak or creak. Very common on the four-wheel drive cars, just going lock to lock. So pulling out of car parking spots, in and out of petrol stations, low speed maneuvers. You'll get a real creak, bed spring creak coming from the front axle. You'd almost swear blind it was coming from the glove box or under the dashboard. It's that kind of area. You don't tend to notice it quite so much higher speed. So if you go doing, higher speed maneuvers, the noise does tend to be muffled by other road noises. Once the squeak has gone and you think, oh, well, the squeak's gone now, it's fixed itself, because obviously that's what Porsches do. It then normally quite quickly translates into a knock. So the squeak and the creak start as the bush in the center of that top mount starts to delaminate. Once it's fully delaminated and it's started to wear itself away, and I think we'll get to a picture of that in the next slide.
It's down at the bottom right, Pete.
The bottom, is it? So yeah, bottom right, as the top mount actually fully delaminates, it then stops squeaking because all of the rubber that was squeaking has perished away. It then starts to knock, and the reason that it knocks is the damper rod has a thrust washer underneath and a thrust washer on top, and it's actually those washers pummeling the top mount, letting you know that it's game over and it's time to do something about it. And I think that probably just about covers the top mounts. The top mounts, they're important. They're the only thing that hold the top of your suspension to the car. So all of the other components that we've mentioned so far have all been low. So they've all been mounted to the subframe and the lower part of the suspension. The top mount is the only thing that keeps the top part of your suspension located to the car. And on the 996 and the 997, this is also the means of adjusting the front camber. So we actually use that top mount inwards or outwards to adjust that attitude of the car. If there's any kind of play in that top mount, it's very difficult for us to guarantee that camber setting is going to maintain. So again, it's important that these are in tip-top health. Right, next one please, Chris. Right, there is a fully delaminated top mount. So this was quite fresh actually. This was a Boxster, but exactly the same parts. This was a Boxster that was in this week. So it was a Boxster project in for all sorts of bits and bobs. Customer, 125,000 miles, had been searching for knocks, creaks and rattles over the last year or so with his local garage. As a result, they changed bits and bobs, and inevitably, as the car goes on a ramp, the noise goes away for a small amount of time, and then it comes back with a vengeance. Got to a point where a customer was, he'd saved up some money, and he was going to treat the car to all new springs and dampers. So first damper that came off the car, front right, and this was what we found as soon as we undid the top mount nut. We've reassembled it without the spring to make it easy for you to see, but you can see that the top mount, which is the bit at the very, very top of the photograph, that should be bonded to the bit that's underneath it that is currently still stuck on the damper rod. So the bit that is stuck above that cone washer is what is left of the top mount bush, and you'll notice that there is no rubber left on it. And the reason that there is no rubber left on it is because it's that worn and it's been moving around and turning around for that long that all of that rubber has actually melted away, and there was no bush. So we were left with the outer case, which is the triangle part, and the inner aluminium sleeve. So needless to say, new top mounts went on that vehicle. Underneath that, you will see the bump stop. So the bump stop is a secondary spring. So it's designed by Porsche and other manufacturers to actually operate as a spring. So you've got your coil spring, which is the metal Zebedee style piece of metal that normally runs on your coilover. But when that runs out of puff, Porsche designed this bump stop to help out. So under hard braking on the front axle or under hard acceleration on the rear axle, these bump stops actually come into play. And believe it or not, that yellow foam, which you can see the healthy picture on the right hand side, that is a stiffer rate than the metal spring that you see ordinarily on your damper. So if you're on those bump stops, you ordinarily would know about it. Because they're used and the car is living on them, and of course as the cars settle or if the car's been lowered over time, you use them heavily, they do perish. And again, if we go back to the worn picture, you can see not only is the colour changed and it looks old and grotty, and the argument is that it probably has done 125,000 miles, it's also fallen to bits, which means that one, the top mount has an even bigger job to do because that bump stop isn't saving it anymore, and two, as the car is braking, depending on what the one on the other side looks like, one side of the car might dive more than the other. So it's really important that these are in good health as well. It's unusual that you would notice this on the drive. I don't think you would, unless you were really, really heavily using the car on circuit. On the road, it would be difficult for you to say, right, yeah, that's my bump stops. Ordinarily, you get the car on a ramp, MOT style tests. Again, these kind of things are normally picked up at an MOT. Sometimes, if you're lucky, that bit that's fallen a bit is hidden underneath the gaiter, which is the bit that's underneath it. When they fail completely, you might notice that the ride becomes quite harsh and abrupt because the damper has nothing to save it, and you're then reliant on the bump stop that's inside the damper, which is normally a solid piece of plastic or polyurethane, to stop the damper from bottoming out. So yeah, it's really important that these are looked after. Same on the rear. The rear of the car, these are less of an issue, mainly because they're not quite so open to the elements, if I'm honest. And the bump stops on the rear are slightly shorter, but front bump stops are a very definite, let's get these looked at. The issue with the bump stops is that they're very, very cheap to buy, but very, very expensive to change. It's a £13 part. But you have to disassemble the majority of the front suspension to get to it, and you should be having the alignment done once they've been replaced. So changing bump stops, although it's a nice, easy, cheap thing to do, can become quite costly for quite a simple thing. Right, next one please, Chris. I think we've got toe arms. So toe arms, so this is the rear toe control arm. So we did the front, which was your steering rack and your inner and outer track rod ends. This is exactly the same thing for the rear. Now obviously you don't have a steering rack on the rear, so this is governed by the location of your rear subframe and your rear toe adjustment, which is done through geometry. So it's a little bit more simple than the front axle, but the same principles apply. You've got a ball joint at the bottom, which goes at the wheel carrier end, and you've got a bush at the top, which goes at the subframe end. And as before, the bush allows predominantly movement up and down, but it allows just a little bit of movement fore aft as well. So under hard cornering, Porsche did design that there was just a bit of dynamic steering in there. When these fail, the first thing that you normally notice is that the rear of the car can become quite loose. You can even get a car that will change direction. So you'll have a car that was lovely and stable, and all of a sudden you might give it some gas, and the car might change direction under throttle. This is more noticeable on the high-powered turbo 996s. So they tend to be really quite hard on rear toe arms. They put a lot of effort through those ball joints, more effort than Porsche designed those ball joints to take, and they get a real hard time. We don't want any steering from the rear axle. We want to do all of that with the steering wheel if we can. And it's not till we get to the 991 that you pay extra for rear wheel steer. So we want to be able to set that rear axle to the minute, and we want it to stay there. So it's really important that those ball joints are in good health. Again, hearing it on the road, worst case, and they would have to be quite worn, you would hear them knock. Not quite as severe as the diagonal arm snooker ball, but more of a common ball joint kind of knock or a clunk. But ordinarily, again, you get the MOT tester up there with his 9 and 3 test on the wheel, and he'll get some movement fore aft, as if it was a wheel bearing. So as if he was checking for wheel bearings. And again, it's really important that those are in good health. Right, next one. So rear upper link arms or upper wishbones, or as again the aftermarket guys tend to call them dog bones, hopefully for the obvious reason, they look like a dog bone. So these are your split upper wishbones, which almost makes the car kind of semi double wishbone. These don't tend to give too much issue on the 996. We've put a worn one at the bottom for you to look at, but bearing in mind that there's 4 of these arms per 996, and we've seen a lot of 996s, we really had to scrit through the scrap to find a bad version of this arm. They don't tend to wear all that often. It's a very simple part. It's a straight arm, it's a simple arm with a metal elastic bush, inner and outer. This particular arm, we believe, came off a very high mileage car that had never had any kind of suspension work done on in its life. and they just started to delaminate and shuffle. They're held to the wheel carrier just with a pinch washer. So once they go, there's actually nothing to stop them from fully delaminating. When they do fail, should they fail, you would notice that the back of the car would become unpredictable. It would probably become quite patchy. And when you hit the bumps, the car might change direction.
For guidance.
The again, same with or braking, the car might behave. We wanted to show you these because they're part of the suspension. Ordinarily, you don't need to worry about these two. Right, next one, please, Chris. Right, so this is the dampers and the springs. So I know it's the same photograph that we've seen before. But we wanted to just shock absorber or the spring. So again, the actual spring. I hope somebody saved us their pudding.
Yeah, exactly. If they could,
No, that's not pudding. That's a dinner plate.
Dinner plate.
Dinner plate. And if you don't eat it all up and the scrapings, then you're not going to get pudding.
No, right. So dampers, springs, shock absorbers, struts, coilovers, call them what you will. On the 996, you've got essentially a coilover, which is the damper with a spring on top of it. Some people refer to coilover as being an aftermarket height adjustable affair, but this is also a coilover. There's many versions of the spring damper set up on the 996, as we said before. So you've got two-wheel drive, you've got four-wheel drive, you've got coupes, you've got cabs, you've got tips, you've got manuals, and then you've got sport height, you've got comfort height, and then you've got performance or X73 as well. And all of those dampers and all of those springs and all of those bump stops are different. Now, Porsche for the 996 of any range use Bilstein dampers as their OEM supplier, and Bilstein and Porsche will say that their dampers are good for up to 100,000 miles. However, we have seen and have experience of dampers failing as low as 18,000 miles, and we've seen cars with over 140,000 miles with dampers that are still healthy. We'll get to the healthy damper thing in a minute, because we have a massive data collection of 996 damper efficiencies. But you will normally know if your dampers are causing you grief, either because they're leaking and it's been picked up at an MOT. So it's quite unusual for front dampers to leak, but rear dampers, it's quite common for rear dampers to leak oil. It normally starts with a mist, so you might get an advisory at an MOT where MOT guy said, you know, you've just got a bit of a misting coming from your damper oil seals. We've seen front dampers leak. The front dampers are made out of relatively cheap, unprotected steel, and we've actually seen the casings leak where they've rusted that bad that the oil has actually just started to leak through them. Over time, they tend to go less efficient, they're less graceful at doing their job, and they normally then go crashy. So first thing you note would be going, you know, over speed bumps or coming off speed bumps. The car might be quite crashy, and the usual acid test, as Chris said before, is the wife doesn't want to get in the car because it's uncomfortable and they don't want to be jiggled around. And if you don't do something about it, you're going to have to sell it and buy another one. So that's normally the first port of call for having a look at your dampers. So mileage and age is the first thing that causes most of the 996 grief. The other thing, obviously, is overexertion or hard use. So any of the guys that are doing, you know, hard sport work, you know, track days, stickier tyres, putting more effort and more heat through these things. We normally allow, you know, 1 track mile equates to 10 road miles. So obviously just bear that in mind if you've done you know, 10 track days this year, 100 miles on track. That's 1,000 miles of wear you've put on your dampers straight away. The springs, we always say a spring is a spring until it isn't a spring. So although they might look groggy and they might look a bit crusty and corroded and covered in mud, as long as that spring is still intact, it will still do the same job that it did 100,000 miles ago. The car will settle on its springs over time. This is normally done in the first sort of 5,000 miles of ownership. So the car, from being brand new to 5,000 miles, will go south. After that, it tends to kind of peter off after that. But we do see issues with 911s across the board where springs will break. And we normally see a trend of phone calls and inquiries from 996 and 997 owners anytime between the end of October and the beginning of March, just as the weather starts to turn. Cars tend to get kept in the garage. They go from hot to cold, hot to cold, hot to cold, and we'll get a phone call saying, I heard a ping and now the back of my car's sagged or the front of my car's sagged. So that's quite common. If the car is heated up and then cooled down quickly, heated up and cooled down quickly, and the spring has got a rust area, and that rust area is then starting to be chafed with a bit of dirt or a bit of grit, or you know, some of those stone chippings that the council put on top of tarmac every year, then the spring will snap. Sometimes you might not know about it. It might snap and stay in place. Other times, the little bit that breaks off, which is normally at the bottom, will fall out on your drive, and you'll pick it up and go, where's that come from? We have had scenarios where customers have had a snap spring and it's actually come out and got lodged in the tyre. So if you hear a noise, you hear a ping or a crack, or you think, oh, my car looks a bit low on that corner, please just investigate it before you drive anywhere, because the bit that breaks off inevitably is very sharp. So yeah, please be careful with that one. Right, next one please, Chris. Right, damper test. So since 2012, we've had a bit of equipment at the workshop where we can test the efficiency of your dampers whilst they're still fitted to the car. And this is just an example. We've got many hundreds of 996s as examples, and I literally scrolled through it and chose a random one. This happened to be a 996 C2 with factory fitted, original, never been changed, MO30 suspension. For those that don't know what the MO30 thing is, it was a factory optioned sport suspension. So it gave you slightly stiffer dampers, slightly stiffer springs, slightly stiffer roll bars, and a 10mm lower ride height. And as Chris has just highlighted with a little circle there, what we can see is that if we look at the silhouette of the damper trace, that front left is a slightly larger fish than all of the others. So this is an indication that that front left damper is just a little bit looser than it should be, just a little bit less efficient than the others. It's by no means failed, but compared to what we would class as normal, it's just not quite doing its job. On our equipment, whilst it's doing the test, it gives us the readout in kind of an MOT style. So a pass, advise, or fail. Now, all of these dampers actually passed their test, and they all achieved the same value, which is 0.3 theta, which again, we've just highlighted at the top there. However, we look for handle imperfection, and we want symmetry across the car. And we would have highlighted to the customer at this stage that although the dampers don't need doing at this point in time, there would be huge benefit in synchronizing those front dampers and getting them to do the same job. So we keep all of this data for every car that we ever see. Now I can't remember because I didn't look at the actual customer name, but should this car come back to us and he was on the same dampers, we would put it on again and we would test it again, and we'd check that they've either not degraded any further if they've got worse. So we can keep a timeline of the health of their dampers. Right, next one, please, Chris. Shopping baskets, right? You've probably all got your shopping baskets already. You've probably closed the window so that the missus doesn't see it, but I'm sure that all of those pop-ups are covered in 996 parts. This is just a very, very small selection. So Michelin tyres, Pirelli tyres, Bridgestone tyres, Hartec refurbished arms. So some of you may or may not be aware that most of those components that I've just listed for the 996 are available through Porsche. So you could go to your local Porsche dealer, buy brand new ones. Hartec do a service where they will refurbish a set of arms. So normally on a service exchange, so they've already got them, and they will supply you with, you know, new track control arms, new toe arms that have had new bushes fitted, and then you give them your worn ones back, and they send them off to be rebuilt. Then you've got OE parts such as TRW and Lemforder. So certain components, like in the picture where the red box is, that's an outer track rod end for 996. That's an OEM part from an OEM supplier, and that OEM supplier is TRW. It's just not bought from Porsche. So it's the same part, just bought from the supplier direct rather than from the main dealer. Same with Lemforder. Things like top mounts, drop links are made by Lemforder. Then you've got the Bilstein B4. So as we said before, Bilstein are the manufacturer supplier for Porsche. So you could go to Porsche and ask for 2 standard replacement Bilstein dampers for your car, and it would come with a Bilstein logo on it and a Porsche logo on it, and a Bilstein part number and a Porsche part number. Or you can go to Bilstein direct and you can buy the same part. It just doesn't come with the Porsche logo on it or the Porsche part number, but for the same part. So that gets you back to OEM quality, OEM parts. We've then listed it as near restore. So for those people that don't want to pay for the OEM prices, and for some parts, there's a very good reason why you wouldn't want to do that. The near restore are not OEM quality parts, but not quite. So we've been fitting Mailer and CTE branded arms for probably the last 6 years now. We had a customer turn up one day with a 996 C4S, and he said, "My 996 C4S coffin arms have failed. Can you fit these?" And he pulled out of his front boot 4 Mailer coffin arms. And we looked at him and went, "We've never seen these before, but we'll give them a punt. It's on your head. You've supplied them. We'll fit them on the basis that you come back in 2 years' time and we get to have a look at them." And he said, "Yeah, absolutely not a problem." So we fitted them back in 2015, and the customer, he's a local customer, did as he was told. He came back 2 years later. He came back 4 years later, and he came back earlier this year, and those parts are still operating perfectly, as good as the OEM. So I'm not quite sure how many miles he's done, but he's well into 40 or 50,000 miles on these parts now, and they're still testing the tested time, and they are a real fraction of the cost of the OEM parts. Then there's other aftermarket parts which we try our best to stay away from. So we've got brands like Hamburg Technic or other parts that are not quite from the same batch as the Mailers and the CTEs. Their quality is variable. It's not quite as well made. Hence the cheaper price tag, and they, as Chris has just written, they cause us pain. We've had certain components on 996 C2s that have been fitted by customers, and then the car has then subsequently come to us for alignment, where these parts have lasted as little as 6 weeks. They've then gone away, they've taken the worn part off, they've exchanged them for another set. They've had to come back to us again to reset the geometry, which is no fault of ours, no fault of theirs. and again another 6 weeks and they've failed. So cheaper is not always better, and do it once and do it right would always be kind of our motto. So just be careful if you are going to look at the aftermarket brands. Do a little bit of homework, and just see which of those brands have been tested by other users, other folk that are in the club, in the forums, and see which ones get the best reviews. But there's a lot of good bits out there, but there's also a lot of bad bits out there. And then I think the next one is upgrades. So that's majority of stuff is OE style replacement parts. Then we've got the upgrade parts. Now, Holly included this in the slideshow to give you a flavour of some of the upgrades that we do. Now, obviously, the upgrade thing is a very personal thing. So this is by no means a menu selection of parts. It's not one size fits all with the 996. We might have one customer whose requirement is a GT south of France with his wife and luggage style car, and they want soft and they want compliant and they want waft. Our other customer might be 60 track days a year in a 200,000 kilometre 996 all-out race car with slicks and roll cage and swanky bits. And if we gave him the same upgrade parts as the customer that wants a waft, he's not going to be that interested in it. So it's not a menu. This is just a selection of a few bits and bobs. So Coney Special Actives, we've put them in there. They are the closest you will get to an OEM style, soft compliant, Grand Tourer style drive. So if you wanted to waft on a Sunday afternoon, the Coney Special Actives give you soft, compliant and gloopy. But if you want to go out for a play with the boys on a Sunday, they do their thing, they stiffen up, they're special active, and the car will then become a sports car. For the guys that are doing more sport work, you'd then go up the system, you'd be looking at the Bilsteins, which we've put there, the B6s, the B16, the PSS10s, PSS9s, which I'm sure you've all heard of. Öhlins, so you've got Öhlins Road and Tracks, Öhlins TTXs, KWs. It's kind of horses for courses there. So you can't go off what your mate's fitted because he thinks it's the best thing since sliced bread. This is quite a personal thing. So, Taurus, RS setups or something in between. You've then got the kind of halfway house type stuff. So you've got the IBAC springs, the H&R springs. That's for the people where it's been proven that their dampers are healthy. That's the most important thing. And they just want to change maybe the appearance of the car, or they want to have a bit of a play at maybe some track work. And they want to take it down to sort of the GT3 stance. Maybe they've put the aero kit on the car. Maybe they've put the sport design wheels on it, and they just want to get the curb appeal. The IBAC springs and the H&R springs will give you that. But again, there's options, and there's other options. You've got the Design Tech springs, you've got the Tech Art springs, you've got Car Graphic. They all give you the same end product, but they all give you a very different ride and a different feel. And then other bits and bobs, which you may or may not have heard of. Elephant Racing, they're an American brand that supply real race car parts for road cars. So that's removing all rubber components from the car, replacing it with metal on metal spherical monoballs. RSS are the same, they're an equivalent. So again, takes the car from being a soft, compliant road car into a bit more of a track animal. And then Renline, who again do similar things, adjustable everything, nice anodized, pretty to look at, bits of jewellery that are almost a shame to fit to the car, but will give you almost infinite adjustability to turn your car into whatever you might want it to be. But there's lots of variations and iterations of all of that. You can almost cherry pick maybe 3 things off that list, and you could all cherry pick 3 things off that list, and we could give 20 different cars that did 20 different things. So it really is, world is your oyster with that one. And I think that about brings us to near enough the end. I think we've got one left. There we go. Favourite mods. This was just for a bit of fun, really. So our favourite mods, we said, right, 3 favourite things to take a perfectly healthy 996, all original, nothing else has been changed. What would you do to modify it relatively cheaply to get the best out of it? And my 3 were optimize the geometry for what you're going to use it for. I really like the cars that have got the RSS semi-solid engine mounts, or even the 993 RS or similar engine mounts. It just stops the wiggle from the rear, massively improves gear change if you've got a manual car, and as you're going around the high-speed corners, it just stops that secondary kick from the rear as you try and straighten things up. And if you want all of that to do its job, depending on what wheel and tyre size you're on, the Michelin Pilot Sport 4s, again, that's quite generic, but if it were my car and it were my 996 to do a lot of jobs, they would be the 3 starting points for me. I'll let Chris tell you his. You can't change your mind now because I put it.
Optimal Geo, horses for courses. So I can give the people that want to do the GT touring stuff stability. I can give them a comfort. I can give them high-speed stability. For the B-Road Blaster, I can give them grip. I can give them sufficient stability to go with a good tight turn-in. So it's the geometry to suit, and the Porsche range gives me the ability to be able to cherry pick what I want out of the car. This is all about the perfect healthy car. Remember, we can't get optimal geo without perfect health. So 120,000 mile tatty track control arm in the bushes is a service requirement first. It must pass the test. I like the cars to turn in and at the expense of a bit of traction. And as you were seeing with what Porsche have done with the Carrera, and then the MO30, and then the X74, what they tend to do to get more eventful turning, more grip, get bite at the front, is to increase the rear spring or the rear roll bar stiffness. I've put here IBAC did a study of what Porsche did, and they developed that's IBAC UK developed a roll bar that was adjustable. So it's like a GT3 roll bar. So you can buy a GT3 roll bar. And it's drop links and fit that to the 996, 911. Or you can do it quite straightforward and cheaper and reasonably effective by using the IBAC roll bar. Lightweight flywheel and clutch. I love the noises that those things make. Lightweight flywheel, so not the dual mass flywheel. I like the revvy, zippy nature of my car, and yeah, that just suits my heeling and towing and gear shift and eventfulness. I guess the occupants, the passengers, would say, "What's that din going on there?" But for me, that would be mine. And you've noticed there that there's no dampers or springs. All there is a requirement for the car to be healthy, which saves everybody money, and we get the best. Remember that 13,000 miler that I talked about? That was in the flush of youth, and was predictable. It was sharp. It was compliant. Well, that's what we like. And as Peter said, upgrades are personal. If I was to say that there's a trend, people sometimes associate the Olins, so for example, the Olins Road and Track is a beautiful product, good quality, and they associate that with the perfect handling, when the Olins Road and Track have been developed from track to road, from road to track, and sometimes we can. And we do modify the spring rates, for example, on the Olins, turn them down to get them to do the job that we want. So just to stop off disappointment, really, when you go the upgrade route, typically the market is for sporty upgrades, and sporty normally comes with noise and some harshness built in. So keep it normal, keep it stock, and keep it soft and compliant and squidgy, and keep it so that the wife, maybe actually if we did do the upgrades, the wife wouldn't want to come with us, which is another bonus, I suppose. And then yes, the PS4s, because we're only given 3 options, but of course the tyre of choice at the moment. That's it from Pete. Brilliant job, thank you. I'm hoping that we've done. We've given you a scope of our experience, and we've answered some of the questions. Ralph, do we have time for questions, or do you want to close down now?
No, it is not going to automatically time out, and we have as much time as everybody is prepared to put in. The information has been great. I think seeing that that pile of parts probably gives life to your point about having a healthy car, and that picture we've just seen is another example of that. So perhaps we might just open up for questions, and I think it's probably going to be who comes on first, and if people could just pause, let the question be answered, and then I'll invite another person to come on, and it's just going to be who gets their question in, and then we all go quiet again, if that works for everybody. Just to kick off on a very simple question, if I may, Chris, do you get cars coming in where the issues also include the state of the tyres?
Yes. We normally will, as we walk out to the car, we'll do a round robin of the car first before we get in, and we're clocking. The high points are the age of the tyre and the age of the tyre on each of the axles. And we know that we're going to be dissatisfied with the ride and the drive. And this is a generalization, but if the tyres are greater than 5-year-old, there are exceptions. There are exceptions where the tyres have been fed well and such, but if they're greater than 5-year-old, I know that I'm going to be disappointed. If there's asymmetry on the tyres, so that Michelin, all manufacturers put a dot code on, which is a date, a year, month, year, week stamp, but also the country that they're made in, the plant, and the mold mark. And if there is if there's a difference across an axle, then I do the Roger Moore, and I rub my hands, because I know that, for example, if there's some asymmetry coming out in the ride evaluation, i.e. the car's pulling to the left or thrusts to the left, if it thrusts to the left, I know that I have to swap the rear tyres over on the axle if I can, it will thrust right. So it's actually the first thing that we review. And we normally go down like Vic Reeves and Bob Mortimer, and we feel the tread patch, the contact patch. 3 millimeters is 3 millimeters and you're out, says Chris, with 2 millimeters on the KN tires today, Pete. but yeah, slap. Yeah, so 3 millimeters on a wide, big surface area reduces load and is the quickest way of an about turn on the motorway if we hit standing water. So 3 millimeters is the safety margin where the tire can get rid of the water. So again, if we're seeing tires less than 3 mil, that's not good.
So you're basically saying not more than rules of thumb, not more than 5 years. Same date range. Certainly types of tires, front and back, and
Yeah.
certainly definitely for each axle, and minimum 3 mil tread depth.
Correct.
Okay, right. So first question.
Peter, ask me a question.
Come on, Andy, you must have a question.
Well, you asked my question. I was going to relate to tyres, really, because obviously there's a lot of cars there with 8 or 9 year old tyres on. Don't get used a lot, and so I think Chris there has answered that question very well.
Okay.
Remember, they've said there were some exceptions there, Andy.
Yeah.
So if the car is being kept in the dark without extremes of temperature, with car boots, we might get vibrations because of flat spots. But the sunshine and extremes of temperature are not the way to treat the tires. The manufacturers, for example, when they're in storage, the storage isn't that long, but in the warehouse they will get rotated and they'll get treated like chickens. They're fed, rotated, and kept in an ambient, low light warehouse.
So it feels more like cheese, actually, Chris.
Just like cheese, Ralph. Just like cheese.
Or mushrooms.
Can you just clarify your opinions on power flexes, bushes? Because a few people do go down that road after that question. No, in some respects, or
No, horses for courses, Andy. Horses for courses. Powerflex is a urethane bush, and is delivered in 2 hardnesses. I think one's 80 units of rubber hardness. The other one is more 99 units of rubber hardness, and the rubber hardness scale goes up to 100. If I were to use an association, GT3, a GT3 will run almost bearings, maybe, and that's spherical bearings that have no give, and a car to be driven with spherical bearings is delightful. One of the things that I mentioned was friction. And it's an enemy of the suspension. In fact, one of the early dampers was a friction damper, the Rosette multi leaves with a big thumb screw, and that would be the effective damper on the axle. When lubricated, the polyurethane Powerflex work wonderfully. They constrain the movements. Probably overly so. So where the rubber bush would allow maybe 6 degrees of freedom, the Powerflex will allow 3 degrees of freedom. And in essence, I think I mentioned the rubber bushings in the rear axle of the 996 and the 993 are different hardnesses. And they're different hardnesses, for example, to allow the Porsche program to operate when we make a mistake. So, for example, we're committed to a turn on the throttle and we lift off. The Weissach effect, which was coined on the 928 and used in the 993 and the 996, is a slight toe-in, and the toe-in is created as a result of differences in hardness of bush. If we shod if we stud the axle with polyurethane, potentially all the same, all purple, we might lose some of those characteristics. Not dangerous. If I put the Powerflex into a GT3 that's doing track work, I fit them, but I don't ever forget them. They have to be, again, fed and watered. So we need to make sure that they're properly greased and replenished, because if they don't get greased or replenished, they're a friction point, and a friction point can then get in the way of the suspension operating in the norm. So long as we fit them with knowledge, a grease nipple, and definitely use the grease. Powerflex have upgraded the grease recently to a synthetic silicon grease, which is brilliant, much better than the copper grease that was being used before. So it's horses for courses, and that's why I put them as an upgrade, because they are stiffer and they're more pure. They give you a car that will change direction much quicker and settle down much quicker than rubber. But never forget that they need to be maintained. And I think that message is missing from, they're very cheap and very accessible. And we've seen them when customers have fitted them themselves. In some cases, they've improperly fitted them. So we have to go in and tidy up. So, but no, not a bad name, so long as we know what we're getting into. In fact, we carry Powerflex in our stocks for tow arms and for track control arms. We do.
I run Powerflex on my car.
Bingo.
You have to just look after them.
And there's Powerflex on my Volkswagen T3 van. The whole suspension system, all Powerflex purple, with a bit of yellow in there as well, because the yellow is softer again. So, good question, Andy.
Yeah, thank you. It was very interesting what you said about the top mounts, the C4 and the C2s. How the C4s are obviously a bit more under a bit more strain because of the drive shaft.
Yeah.
I wasn't aware of that.
If I would say, to get a visualization of what the top mount has to do, if the adventurous ones like Dares and the modified team jack the front of the car up with a C4 and have a C2 on hand and just turn the road wheel using the 9 and 3 o'clock thing, what you'll see is the damper do a sweep fore and aft as you turn the wheel. And it wrenches the neck. It almost wrings the neck of the bush in the C4 top mount. Whereas the C2, when you do the fore and aft on the 9 o'clock, 3 o'clock of the wheel, road wheel, the turn is done right up the center of the bush, so it doesn't actually deform it. That's what we see.
Yeah, thank you.
Okay. I'm not sure there's any more questions coming. I've just got one that we sort of haven't talked about on this, but just sort of general information. Toe in and toe out. So I'm on to alignment here, and front and a rear. So without getting into whether it's best at, you know, two seconds or minutes or whatever, are we looking for toe in or toe out at the front? And if so, why? And are we looking for toe in or toe out at the back? And if so, which one and why?
Well, the sick of hearing my voice, mate. So if you would, I don't know if you could dive in there.
Again, horses for courses, Ralph. But every 996 on the planet, I think bar none, always toe in on the rear axle. So toe in gives the axle stability. It scrunches the tyre. It gives us grip. It's a way of getting heat into the rubber. However, the front axle, depending on what you're using the car for, and your preference and what you like and what you don't like, the majority, I would say 85, maybe 90% of users will run toe-in on the front axle. Again, because exactly the same reasons. It gives us stability, it gives us a nice solid steering wheel, it gives us confidence, it gives us that nice syrupy steering feel. But that 10% that want a bit more Lotus Elise, or maybe a slightly sharper turn, mostly the track guys, they will run a little bit of toe out on the front only. The reason for that is toe out, the front of the car then kind of almost wants to change direction before you do. So that initial turn-in is already there before you know about it. So as soon as you give that steering wheel an inclination of changing direction, the front of the car will go. Now, the trade-off there is that if we were to give you that in a road car, of course, British roads aren't renowned for being all that straight and all that perfect. The car then changes direction outside of your control all of the time, and it relates on a long straight bit of motorway to a front of car at 70 miles an hour that is constantly trying to change direction. And it makes it very fidgety. Some people refer to it as vague because they can't quite work out what the front of the car is doing because it's moving around underneath them, and it's a sensation that they're not happy with. So I would say 90% of the population in a 996 would run just a little bit of toe-in on the front and a bit more on the rear. And the guys that are a little bit more hardcore and doing a bit more circuit work, they might run just a little bit of toe out, but not a lot.
On the front.
On the front.
Can I add to that?
Yeah.
If I turn in at the roundabout with a car that looks like standard setup, standard cambers, a 996, and we go into the roundabout 20 miles an hour, and the back end steps out at 20 miles an hour, you'll go, oh, that's toe out. And
on the rear,
for whatever reason. So Pete was saying a stable axle. A stable axle is one that you can lean on. It's if we've got a walking stick with a nice rubber end, we want to lean on it and we want to push off it. And toe out on the rear axle is like having Vaseline on our rubber stopper on our walking stick. You can't lean on it, you can't power off it without it wanting to change direction. It's like trying to step on an unchocked roller skate, whereas toe-in, the toe-in produces a extra traction without adding weight over the wheel. At a cost, because of course it meshes with the road, which means it heats up a bit more, and it causes fuel wastage maybe. But we never go to toe out on a rear-wheel drive car, or definitely not the 996 or the 911. But we do get close. Some people don't have any of the other accoutrements and they want a car that turns. So what we'll do is we'll give them neutral toe at the front, so it's halfway house between in and out, and we'll give them as little toe at the rear as we dare, and we're always green, so we can toe in just enough to keep the Porsche police happy.
Okay. Well, look, thank you very, very much, both of you, and Holly in the background and the.
Yeah, here, Ralph. Yeah, thank you, Pete, Chris, and Ralph for organising this.
And your young son, Pete. Good to see you.
Do you have time for one question?
There you go.
Sorry, hold on a second. Hand up. You have a question?
Yeah, it's Will here.
Hi, Will.
Just a very quick question for the guys. I've got a 996 turbo, and I was going to give it a suspension refresh. I was thinking I'll go OEM, probably. I was going to do it myself, and then take it into my garage to get an alignment afterwards. Now, is it possible for me, I'm going to get it, obviously I'll try and get it as close as possible, but is it possible for me to get it so far wrong that I actually don't want to risk driving it to the garage to get that alignment done? Is it possible that I will go that far wrong?
No, you won't go that far wrong. Have you got common sense, Will? If you've got common sense and good eyesight, I would say as a bare minimum, if you can get the car so that by eye it looks right, that is normally sufficient for you to at least drive it to your garage.
Yeah, and then they can tweak it to make sure it is exactly back.
When you say refresh, to what degree would you be changing parts? Are we talking just springs and dampers, or are we looking at arms and things as well?
Yeah, no, springs and dampers and bump stops, maybe the top mounts. Yeah.
Okay, so if you, on the front of the car, mark where the top mount is currently, so under open your bonnet, take your pollen filter covers off and mark those 3 nuts where the top mount is. If you put them back to where you find them, that will get you reasonably close. It'll get you as close as what it is now, and that's presuming that what you've got is correct now. The rear of the car, you don't actually need to upset any of the alignment adjusters to take the rear damper off. So you can take your rear damper and spring off and build the new one and put it back on without upsetting your rear geometry. The only thing that you need to bear in mind is that the height might change. So if you replace with OEM, the car will go up slightly, potentially. And as a result of it going up, you will have less camber than what you have now. And the rear toes will decrease and your front toes will increase. But you should still keep the symmetry that you've got currently. So like the first comment, I would say common sense. If you stand behind the car and look at the wheels and they kind of look all right, then they probably are all right. If you stand behind the car and you can see that your rear left wheel is pointing to your front door, then it probably is pointing to your front door and you'd need to change that. But we've had customers that have rebuilt cars and they've gone to the nth degree on their garage floor using their eyeball and a ruler. And I tell you what, they get it a darn sight closer than some other garages that have got the latest and greatest. So you'll be fine.
Could I add another little one there,
Okay.
Will? Just another little snippet. It's the 996 Turbo, Pete. So he's going to have to manipulate the damper out of the wheel carrier, which has also got the drive shaft connected to it.
On the front,
we normally take the disconnect the wheel carrier, undo the drive shaft, isolate the drive shaft so we don't scratch it, and pop the ball joint on the lower control arm, don't we?
I would leave the ball joint on the lower control arm and undo it at the subframe and take the whole coffin arm and wheel carrier and damper off the drive shaft and just leave it all assembled.
Yeah, so you leave, good point. Leave your drive shaft in situ, but disconnect it from the wheel hub. You'll need 400 Newton meters of torque to undo it, and you're going to need, I think,
32 mil socket.
A 32 mil socket, and a copper faced mallet just to gently tap out that splined drive shaft.
Okay.
If you go and start now, Will, you'll have it done by midnight.
I haven't got a question, but
Graham.
yes, okay. I've C4 30,000 miles. Suspension quite good. Took my car to these guys. I drove one car in and drove a completely different car home, and it's absolutely brilliant now.
Well,
we've still got your car at the workshop, Graham.
Oh, Graham, he's talking about us.
Thank you.
I fell off my seat.
And And it's just amazing the difference it made doing the geo on the car and just getting it all where it should be. And it's not about what the numbers say, it's actually what these guys actually do to the numbers that make the difference. And it's just become an awesome piece of kit and so much fun to drive.
How did it make you feel, Graham?
Just great.
Yeah.
Just completely, would not have believed it. Wouldn't have believed it. The best money to spend on your car is to get a geo done by these guys. It will override anything else you spend your money on.
Can I ask you, Graham, what was the catalyst for you making that call and booking it?
I put H&R lowered springs on it, and when I was pushing hard with it, it got a bit wiggly woggly, and a lot of the things you were describing, nothing more, and it just felt like I was needing to do something to tighten it up. Yeah. And it was purely geometry, and you know what it does when you drop the car with these things. As you showed me, it all goes to pot. And you brought it all back and made it to what I wanted for what I was driving, and you adjusted the height at the back of the car as well.
That's right. Yeah, we put some shims under it.
Yeah, you lifted it 7 mil, and it is a completely transformed car to drive. Just driving it out of your yard, I could tell I was driving a different car at 10 miles an hour. But I've driven it since then, a lot of miles since lockdown, and it is awesome. The grip it has got is unbelievable.
It's satisfying, isn't it? Very satisfying. Yeah. Okay, Graham. Thank you very much
and
for
it's
that.
Easy for it. It's brilliant. Just go and do it, guys. Worth every penny.
Thank you.
Thank you, Graham.
We
Can I
can't
ask
say,
a quick question? Sorry, one last one.
Okay.
The stuff you said about 996, generally applicable to 997s as well?
Absolutely, yeah.
Great, thank you.
Except if you're changing the rear dampers and springs on a 997, you have to take the tow control arm off because you can't get the bolt out, the lower bolt, and then you're into rear tow. So again, common sense prevails. When putting the rear tow adjuster bolt back in, have a look down the car and make sure that the wheels don't look wiggly. If they're pointing dead ahead, that's good enough to get you safely, slowly to the alignment, your alignment garage.
Thank you very much.
You're welcome, Anthony.
okay, any more for any more?
Can I ask Pete a question?
Yes, Paul.
Yeah, Pete, you mentioned removing the lower coffin arm from the subframe.
Yes.
I can't get my bolts to shift. Do you find that as a problem?
Are we talking about the front coffin arms now?
Yes.
That's quite unusual for 996. Is that the lock nut that you've struggled with, or the actual through bolt?
The bolt. I can get the nut slacking, but the bolt seems to be seized into the boot.
Right. Okay. What scope of work do you need to do to remove the arm? Is it springs and dampers that you're looking to change?
I've already done the dampers. Yes. I just thought I would change the lower coffin arm.
So if the coffin arm is healthy and the ride height is going to go back to the ride height you were at before, then there's an argument that you could leave the coffin arm where it is. However, if the ride height is going to change, that bush that is seized in your subframe is going to remember its old ride height. So if you've put lowering springs on, or if you put brand spanking new Porsche springs on, the car will either go down or it will go up. And that coffin arm bush, although may be healthy now, will wear out quite quickly afterwards. The best thing you can do is invest, because it's inevitable that you're going to have to do it at some point, is invest in a reciprocating hacksaw and some decent 24 TPI hacksaw blades. And those bolts are relatively soft steel. Just whip it out and replace the bolt when you replace the coffin arm.
So would you cut through the rubber ends of the bushes?
Yeah, absolutely. So either side of the sub, so if you look at the subframe from underneath, either side inboard where the bush flange is tapered, you'll be able to get your hacksaw blade up either side. And if you cut upwards, you'll have to cut through a little bit of the rubber, a little bit of the aluminium sleeve of the bush, and then you'll be through the bolt.
There you go, Pete. I've put the metallastic bush and the cut, if this is the blade, there, the blade is there. And what you're doing is you're cutting that bit off, because of course the subframe is abutting against this face here. So what you're doing is you're going to sacrifice, and you know, if you go offline with your cut, you're going to cut into the arm. Well, that's okay because it's toast. And you're going to cut through, the bolt goes through here. So you're cutting through rubber, aluminium, and then the steel, right the way through to the bottom, and then you have to do the other side as well.
Yeah. Okay, great. Thank you very much.
Welcome.
It's not a very fun job, that. It's not going to be one that you'll enjoy very much, but you'll feel good once you've done it.
Yes. Thank you.
Okay, any more for any more?
Well, my wife wants her pudding, so
that's really good point to conclude. And again, thank you very much to Chris and Pete and Holly in background.
Here.
And
Yeah, thanks for everybody attending as well.
Yeah, very good.
Excellent presentation, Chris and Pete. Well done.
Thank you, Andy.
And thank you again to Ralph for organising this. It's been a fantastic, interesting evening.
Okay.
Really informative. Thank you, guys. Thank you.
Very.
right, go and get your puddings. Have we found out what the scrapings were before and whether they got their pudding? Right, good night, God bless you lot.
Right.
Thanks,
Bye.
Thanks, Chris. Thanks,
Bye for
Pete.
now.
Thank you all very much. Thank you. Brilliant evening.
Thank you very much.
Yeah,
Thank you.
Thank you.
Yeah.